Hello again, plant friends. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah, and today, surprise, surprise, we will be talking about Hoyas. If you're new here, welcome. I talk about Hoyas quite frequently here on this channel, as well as a variety of other houseplants. So if that's something that's of interest to you, take a moment, hit that subscribe button, and make sure you turn on the notification bell so that you can be notified every time I post a new video. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's video. As you can probably tell from the title, today's video is all about 7 great Hoyas for beginners. Now, I've determined this through a number of factors, things like how easy they are to get a hold of, how fast they grow, and how easy they are to take care of in your house. Do they need extra things like grow lights or humidity or things like that, frequent waterings, things like that. So I've taken into account a variety of things as I selected today's plants, the first of which being how easy are they to get a hold of for beginners. Thinking about getting a hold of them locally at a nursery, and especially getting a hold of an already established plant and not just a cutting. I also took into consideration the price. Now, I do have a variety of price points in front of me, and I didn't necessarily just pick the cheapest Hoyas to get a hold of, but I didn't want to pick the most outrageously expensive priced Hoyas either. When looking at ease of care, I wanted to take into consideration if there were any modifications needed to the environment, so not necessarily Hoyas that need high humidity, Hoyas that will do okay if they're not getting the brightest light all the time, things like that. And then finally, I also took into consideration how fast they grow. Now again, there might be some variety here within this group, but I tried to pick Hoyas that are going to give you some good growth, establish themselves, and do well in your home. So the first Hoya that I picked that I would recommend to beginners would be the Hoya carnosa, just the plain green variety. I picked this one for a variety of reasons. First being that it is one of the easiest Hoyas to get a hold of. I can pretty much guarantee that you can find an already established plant at a nursery or a big box store near you. You could probably find one at a local plant swap, get one from a friend, take a cutting from a relative's plant, something like that. The plain green carnosa is going to be super easy to get a hold of. I also find it's one of the hardiest types of Hoyas. It's really hard to mess it up. It's a great one to figure out the watering, the light requirements, things like that. It's not going to be the pickiest of the Hoyas. So if you make a little bit of a mistake, if you're still learning, you're kind of over or under watering it or not quite giving it enough light, it's not going to just die on you. As far as price goes, if you do end up paying anything for it, it's not going to be very much. But like I said, you probably can get a hold of a cutting or an already established plant at a local plant swap or from a relative. I know I have a couple on hand at all times that I'm just giving away to my friends, already established plants. So it's not going to be very expensive for you to get a hold of or replace either. And as far as the speed of growth, I do find it is a pretty quick growing Hoya. Again, this will depend a little bit on your conditions. For me, I have it kind of tucked away in a spot that it's not getting the most premium light in my house, but it does get enough light and it grows fairly quickly. So for all of those reasons, the Hoya carnosa green variety is going to be my top pick if you are just starting out with Hoyas. And my next 2 Hoyas are going to go along the same lines. My next choice for you will be the Hoya carnosa Crimson Princess. So the Princess does have the white on the insides, and the Princess is a little bit easier to get a hold of and to find than the Queen, but not by a whole lot. These show up quite frequently in big box stores, local nurseries, and again, you might even be able to pick up a cutting or an established plant from a plant swap or even from a friend who has Hoyas. As far as care requirements go, it's going to be very similar to that plain green carnosa, just taking into account the variegation. So you won't want to go quite so extreme with your light. You won't want to put it directly in bright light, nor will you want to tuck it away in your darkest corner. But overall, it will take those same care requirements as the plain carnosa. Price will be very similar again to the plain green carnosa. So overall, very similar to that first plant, probably a really close second to the plain green carnosa. The plain green carnosa just barely edged that one out just because it is a little bit easier to get a hold of. But if you keep an eye out in your local nursery or your local big box store, it won't be too long before you see a Hoya carnosa Crimson Princess popping up there. And again, a very close third is our Hoya Crimson Queen. So the Queen has the white along the outside versus the Princess that has the white on the inside. Hopefully you can see that. And again, this one, similar to the first two, it just kind of slid into that third spot because it is a little bit more difficult to get a hold of. I do see it pop up pretty frequently, not necessarily in big box stores, but at local nurseries. And it sometimes is a little bit more expensive. So if those other carnosas are going to run you well under $20 for an established plant, I've seen the Crimson Queen pop up from anywhere from $15 to $30 for a small established plant. So again, not a bad price, especially for an established Hoya, but again, just barely dropping into third underneath those first two. Like I said, everything else with the Crimson Queen should be very similar to the plain green and especially to the Princess. You might not want to be putting it directly in your window nor putting it in your darkest corner, but overall the care requirements are going to be very similar and it's going to be another very forgiving Hoya for you. So those first three, again, were very, very similar, just variations on the same plant. And now we will jump into another Hoya that I highly recommend, and that is any variety of a Hoya pupacalyx. So this one, as you can see here, is my very, very splashy pupacalyx red buttons. Now, I didn't specify a type of pupacalyx for this because it's going to kind of depend on where you go. I have seen the Royal Hawaiian, the pink silver, a few like that pop up quite frequently, either in local stores or on websites like Etsy or major plant shops. You can usually find some variety of a Hoya pupacalyx for a really reasonable price. Depending on the variety you get, there are a few rarer varieties of the pupacalyx, but for the most part, again, those will run you very similar to the Crimson Princess or the Crimson Queen, somewhere under $20 or $30 for a well-established plant with lots of growth on it. As far as care requirements go, again, it's going to be very similar to the Carnosa. It's a pretty forgiving variety of Hoya and actually can tolerate quite a bit of light. And as you can see, this one was grown from a small 2-leaf cutting, and I've had it just not quite a year yet. And as you can see, lots and lots of new growth. So a very fast growing variety, one that will be very easy for you to have in your home. So all of those first 4 Hoyas are going to be super easy for you, really easy to get a hold of, really forgiving Hoyas that are easy to learn on. And now I'm going to go a little bit into, I don't want to say they're rarer Hoyas because certainly none of these are rare or hard to get a hold of. They may just pop up a little less frequently, or you may have to get a smaller plant for a higher price. But again, really great Hoyas that should be pretty easy to get a hold of locally or on your favorite website. And again, really easy to take care of. So the next Hoya I have was one of my first 3 Hoyas that I owned, and I actually did get it locally from another plant collector, but I got an already established plant for a really reasonable price. I think it was like $10 for an established plant with the pot. And that is the Hoya lacunosa. Again, it depends on the variety. There are certainly some rarer varieties of Hoya lacunosa, but in general, you see a lot of cuttings of these come up, a lot of established plants coming up. You probably can find one locally, and I do believe every once in a while I've seen this one pop up in big box stores and in nurseries. So one that maybe not as frequently as the Princess, but on occasion you can certainly find it in those bigger box stores. It is a little bit further down my list, again, just because it is a little bit harder to get a hold of, though certainly not hard by any stretch of the imagination. And it is a little bit more difficult care. Again, not a lot, just I'm being really picky on putting things on my list. And because it has the smaller leaves and a little bit thinner leaves, it's more important to get the watering exactly right. You may run into a few issues if your care isn't quite on par, but again, pretty forgiving, one that is not going to up and die on you if you decide to give it a little extra water one day. As far as speed of growth, this one has been by far one of my faster growing Hoyas, and it also is a really frequent bloomer with scented blooms. So a great one for beginners if you are wanting to get those blooms nice and fast. The Hoya lacunosa is a great one that I would strongly recommend to beginners. All right, number 6 on my list is again one that comes up pretty frequently, not too hard to get a hold of, although I do see it kind of go in cycles. I do see it probably a few times a year at my local nursery. And remember, I live in kind of a smaller town, so I'm not in a big city by any means. I'm sure it's much easier to get a hold of in the bigger cities. That one is the Hoya obovata. As far as ease of care goes on this one is probably one of my easiest care Hoyas. It's got these nice thick woody stems, big thick leaves, and it's very obvious when it needs water. The backs of the leaves will get really super wrinkly. So it's a really easy care one, maybe even easier than the Carnosa. It's just a little further down my list because of a couple reasons. One, it's a little bit harder to get a hold of. Not a lot, again, I'm being really picky here, but if I were to compare it to something like a regular green Carnosa or a Crimson Princess, those I could probably walk down to the store and get on any given day. This one you might have to wait a few months until it pops up in your store. The other reason is, although it's certainly not a slow grower by any means, it's definitely not my fastest growing Hoya either. It just takes a little time to put out these big leaves. I've taken plenty of cuttings of this in the year and a half that I've owned it, and it's put out plenty of new growth. You can see even here in October, it's still putting out lots of new growth. So it's not a slow grower by any means, but again, probably not as fast as something like a regular green Carnosa or a Crimson Princess. So again, even though it's further down my list, the Hoya obovata, if you can get a hold of one, especially an already established plant, at a pretty reasonable price, I think I paid $20 for a plant a little bit smaller than this, I highly recommend that you go ahead and get a hold of one as a beginner with Hoyas. And the last Hoya on my list is probably the hardest one on this list to get a hold of, although I do see it pop up quite frequently on plant purge pages, on plant websites. I don't know if I've seen it in a local nursery before, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did pop up. And that is the Hoya macrophylla, the elbow marginata. So again, like a lot of the Hoyas on my list, it's got the thicker stems, the thicker leaves, so it's not going to be quite as picky when it comes to watering. And in fact, it really likes a lot of sunlight. As you can see, I have a few sun-stressed leaves on here, so giving it extra sunlight is not going to be a problem at all for this plant. As far as ease of care goes on this plant, it is definitely up there with the rest of the plants on this list. Super easy to care for. It's only number 7 on my list today because it is a little bit harder to get a hold of, although like I said, it pops up quite frequently online and at a pretty reasonable price. You could probably get an established plant with 2 or 3 leaves for under $25 really easily. So a little bit more expensive, but not bad by any means on the Hoya scale, especially for an already established plant. The other reason it's a little bit lower on my list is it is somewhat of a slower grower. So I've had this one just under a year now, and you can see a few points of new growth. I have taken 2 cuttings from this plant for people that wanted it, so it's just kind of recovering from that. But again, not my fastest grower by any means, but also not a slow grower. So I think that does it for my top 7 Hoya recommendations for beginners. And a little disclaimer, obviously everything I've said here, I've gone kind of on generalities, things that are true in my area and things that I've noticed online. Things may be slightly different in your area, especially as far as price and ease of getting hold of these plants. Be sure to let me know in the comments down below if these plants are readily available in your area, if there are some Hoyas that are much more common than these in your area, and if you have any recommendations for people who are just starting out with Hoyas. As always, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you leave me a thumbs up letting me know you enjoyed today's video, and I will see you with another video very soon. Bye.